What I'm learning about grief is that this friend doesn't intend to leave me, but promises to hold my hand, to carry my memories, a friend who will bear witness to my love as I venture toward the next day and the following night.
I'm Mary Jo Greco, and I'll be your host for this series of videos about a complex experience we all go through at some point. And yet, for most of us, we know little about the physical, psychological, and social manifestations. That common experience is called grief. And this series of videos will explore the very human season of the heart to deepen our understanding of the process and provide some strategies for coping. With me today are Lori Rogers and Jamie Losikoff Kent. Today's episode is an introduction and overview of the experience of grief. So let's start. Why don't you introduce yourselves and tell us what you hope viewers will get out of these programs? Lori, would you care to start?
Sure. I'm Lori Rogers, and I am from here in Manchester. My background is in chaplaincy, so I was trained in spiritual care to work with trauma, loss, and grief. I've been working in hospice for the past few years, and at the hospice where I work, I am the bereavement coordinator, and I help facilitate grief groups. My hope is that this series brings some light to this very natural process that we call grief, so that people can understand it for themselves and maybe somebody that they know that's going through this.
And what about you, Jamie?
Well, I'm fairly new to Vermont. I moved up here from Virginia a few years ago, and when I was working in Virginia, I spent about 16 years as a licensed clinical social worker dealing with people who are going through grief and loss. When I moved to Vermont, I hooked up with the local hospice here and have been volunteering my time with working with Lori to provide support to people in the community who have had a loss and are grieving. And I'm hoping that through this series of videos, we can widen that audience and encourage more people to come forward and seek help.
When Bo passed, I was fairly numb at the time, so I was in a world that I didn't recognize. I was in shock and numb. I don't think I felt very much of anything. I went home, drove home. It was 1 o'clock in the morning at that point, and I don't remember the drive. I don't remember getting home. I just remember the next day getting up alone. And it has persisted for quite a while. And it's getting better, slowly getting better.
I think one of the questions that I have is, what is grief?
We would normally define grief as, number one, a universal, very human, holistic response to loss. Grief can come from the loss of many things. We often most prominently think of it as loss due to the death of a loved one.
Grief is what I call a season of the heart. It's sort of it's the place we are when we're getting from something that, a change that happened, to sort of accepting that that change really has happened and that it's permanent, sort of. So grief is that in-between stage. That's how I see it.
And how does grief manifest itself? Is it the same for everyone?
No. And grief is so much more. People think about grief as a feeling, but grief has a physical, emotional, spiritual, and psychological effect on our lives, as well as a social. And for someone who has had a loss, it's like their whole world has changed.
At 82, I'd experienced many deaths and losses, but nothing hit me like losing my wife. We were together for 64 years. I could not stop crying, feeling sharp pain in my stomach and chest. I had trouble sleeping and couldn't pay attention to anything or anyone. I felt I was drifting in space because the source of gravity that held me down was gone. And my mind kept telling me that the next time the phone rang, it would be her telling me she was going to be late and was on her way home.
Because grief is a stressor, it's going to change the way our brain works. It can influence your immune system, it influences your sleep, it influences how you function during the day.
And what are some of the responses to grief that are common?
Everybody's experience of grief is different. I would say that for most people, there's an acute phase of grief when you first get the news or when the loss is really fresh. That can be a really kind of an intense time for most people. So that's the time where we really need a lot of support and a lot of extra care for ourselves, because it can be the time where you sort of forget to eat, you forget to think straight, and you're sort of on autopilot at that time. So that's the beginning of grief, and that's the sort of what we call the acute phase, where the pain is really intense and the confusion is sort of there. And then then the loss starts to become more of a reality, and then the grief, the symptoms of grief will actually sort of change. It's a fluid situation, and everybody experiences it differently. So sometimes, sometimes people are sort of numb at the beginning, and they might have more of the emotional part as they move through the grief journey.
A lot of people will call it, will describe it as coming in waves. That sometimes you're on an even keel, and then all of a sudden you're overwhelmed.
I don't know. I have the feeling I need to cry. It's in there. It needs to come out. I have no clue why I can't cry. I miss him so much. Oh, he was my other half. He just complimented me in so many ways. Oh, Lee.
So people know something is going on. Do they necessarily recognize it as grief, or do they think they've lost their mind, or?
A lot of people think they're just going crazy.
Yeah, it
Because-
can really
yeah.
pull people up off their moorings, so they lose almost their identity, and it can be quite an unraveling of your reality.
People come to realization of grief on their own, or do family members or friends have to goad them into facing what they're going through?
I'd say that people know what they're going through. They might not be able to name it. But the pressure from the outside is usually, when are you going to be better? And so a lot of people come to a point where they just don't know if they're, quote unquote, doing it right, when there's really no script. There's no way to do it. It's just an overwhelming experience. One speaker that I admire a lot once said that it's like being dropped in the middle of a wilderness. You don't get a compass, there's no trail, you find your way out. And each person's going to find their way. The problem often is other people who care about them want them to be better.
Want them to be their old self.
Right, or it's
Snap
been
out.
2 months, aren't you over that yet? And so that makes it really hard for a person to walk through their own grief on their own terms.
And are there things that family and friends can do to ease the burden or to steer a person in the right direction?
Yeah, sadly, we live in a culture where, the show must go on, right? There's not a lot of space and time for this type of, in the old days, we would put the black band or the black veil around people. And we would know that they were sort of in an altered state and that they needed time and space, and they were given time and space. And they were actually elevated sometimes in society as being in a special phase, you know. But in this day and age, we're just, one of the most discombobulating things for grieving people is that the world just keeps going and that they don't have time to really process what's happening, you know, and that their loved one is gone and here we are, just go on like life is going on as usual. So that can be a really difficult thing. So if somebody asked me what could I do for my loved one who's grieving, I would say to really just allow them to grieve and to just honor that, because it is a really important, powerful time in someone's life.
Do individuals or even society in general perceive grieving as a sign of weakness and, you know, something that you don't want to admit to?
Some people, I think, do. You know, and again, that comes to your family culture, your religious beliefs, and it can be confusing for some people because what they're feeling is not what they've been taught they should be feeling. However, there are many cultures in the world who honor grief in a different way, and they have more rituals and more ways of celebrating the life, of respecting and honoring the mourning. And I think that those cultural habits and rituals really help. And that's one thing that's kind of sad about our culture today. I mean, 3 days bereavement leave, and because people are less focused on religious ceremonies, they're looking for ways to process the loss that in a formalized way, and there are fewer and fewer ways to do that.
And Mary Jo, when you asked, when you sort of made the comment that people should just move on, that kind of thing. I think a lot of times the grievers themselves are the hardest ones on themselves. So they don't feel like they should be experiencing their grief so intensely, and that they should be moving on. So all of those society biases and that pressure that we get really gets internalized by the grieving person, and that can complicate grief.
Yes,
because I feel like a healthy grief journey is also it's like developing trust in yourself that you can endure this, and trusting the process itself, which is a mystery. It's really confusing for people. Grief is a profound experience. So
It's a devastating experience, but it's also transformational. And as we go through life, we have losses all through life. And if we look back, we notice how much we learn and change and grow through these changes in our lives. And when we don't honor that and want to rush through it, we get into trouble a lot of the time. I think the other thing that's hard for people when they're grieving is if they're not given time to be with what's happening, it can be really confusing, especially in the first few months to 6 months when your cognitive functions are impaired because of the stress that grief brings on and the trauma that often comes with it. That people can't concentrate at work. Some people can't pick up a book because they can't look at the words. Some people, just they spend all day doing one or two things because they just can't bring themselves together, so to speak. And when you're pressured by other forces to get on with it, it's really distressing. And so a lot of physical manifestations, as you asked before, will come out. Many people who've been caregivers for years just fall apart afterward. Grief can be exhausting. And you need that time to rest. You need to nurture your body. You need to take care of your heart.
And how does the grieving person know where they are in the process and when to reach out and how to reach out for help and support?
that's a really good question.
A really good one.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think the grieving person usually knows where they are in the process. They just know they're in pain. And when you're in pain, it can be, well, I feel like the grief process is pretty lonely, right? Nobody can actually come into the loss with you. So that its nature is a solo journey. So it can be very lonely. You know, that's why the grief groups are so important and so helpful, because it sort of brings a little fresh air to the story, to the exposure, to sort of help the loneliness a little bit.
Well, you've certainly given us a tremendous overview of the grief journey. Thank you for watching this program and sharing this information. Our next episodes will delve into strategies for coping with grief and ways to support those who are grieving.
As long as I can, I will look at this world for the both of us. As long as I can, I will sing with the birds. I will laugh with the flowers. I will pray to the stars for both of us.